Currently reporting from Houston, Texas with Megan. All you OG subscribers already know who she is. But anyway, the reason we're here in Houston is to enjoy the city and also see Morgan Wallen in person. He has a concert right here actually at Minute Maid Park tonight. So we're both fans of Morgan Wallen. We're gonna go check him out live. But secondly, and more importantly, we're gonna be playing some poker. Well, we is not the right term, just me, not her. I'm gonna be going to Champions Card Club, which I don't really know much about, aside from the fact it's 30 minutes away. So I'm gonna show you guys around the casino or card club or whatever this place is. And they also have a live stream, which is $25.50 or perhaps $50-100. Of course, I'll be partaking in that. Fingers crossed that it goes well. If it doesn't, at least it'll be fun and we'll get to see a new property on the vlog. It's been a minute since I went somewhere new. So stay tuned for some cards coming up and maybe I'll include some footage from the Morgan Wallen show. Enjoy. Alright, so I've tried all day to convince her to play, but she's not going to do it. So it's just going to be me on stream today. First impressions are this place is beautiful. They seem to have everything a poker player could want. And apparently the food is killer, which I'll report on later. And so will she, because she's going to get like steak or salmon or something. But yeah, enough of the gibberish. Showed you guys around a little bit. Now it's time to get into some actual poker. Good luck, us. All right, guys, here we go. New scene for the vlog. We're playing at Champions Poker Club today in Houston. And in the first interesting hand of this $25.50 game, I look down at Ace-King suited. One of the best possible starting hands. Pretty warm welcome, I should say. I open it up to 200 and get some immediate action from Slick Rick on my left, who makes it 600. He's also got a real hand with his pocket queens, but of course when it gets back to me, Ace-King suited is surely worth another raise. So that's what I do. I make it 1,800 to go. Back on Slick Rick now, and with a $10,000 starting stack, I think you could go either way here, but since we're both in early position, we should both have some pretty strong holdings. So I like his choice to just call in position and go to a flop. 10-8-5 with one spade seems pretty neutral to me. I should still have stronger overpairs than my opponent, but of course, this time I just have ace high. Nevertheless, I'd bet small with all my hands, so that's what I do here, 700 bucks. Slick Rick calls, and I'm planning on continuing to bet turns that are good, like any Broadway card or a spade, of course. But the deuce of hearts isn't exactly my favorite card, so I decide to shut down and check, see what he does. We could still have the best hand if he's got a hand like ace queen of clubs. Yeah, sometimes he'll have overpairs, but we might still be ahead, so I'm not planning on giving up just yet. Trying to see what he does, and what he does is bet small, $1,200. With such a small bet, considering we're still beating some weaker ace highs, and of course can always hit an ace or king to improve, I decide to come along. Folding, I don't think would be terrible, but again, we're getting such a good price to call. The pot is over 6,000, and we only have to call 1,200 bucks. So I toss in the money, and we see the ace of diamonds on the river. With such a good card for me and such a poor card for him, generally speaking, I decide to lead out and jam for his remaining stack of $6,300. If he's got an ace, I expect this to get paid off. If he's got a pocket pair that, of course, hates this ace, I don't suspect he'll call, but who knows, he might get curious and think that I'm bluffing. In the end, though, Slick Rick decides to save his chips for a later hand, which is kind of the nature of the early hands, typically, of a live stream. People are pretty snug, so he does make the correct fold. We take this first pot down. The very next shuffle, this hand comes up where I straddle to 100 bucks. Slick Rick opens to 250, and only I make the call from the straddle with an offsuit ace. Pretty weak holding, wouldn't necessarily mind a fold against an early position open, but this time I come along and we flop top pair with a backdoor nut flush draw. It's ace, king, jack with two diamonds. Interesting flop. I check it, and now I expect Slick Rick to bet pretty big on this kind of board since he opened from early position, but to my surprise, he bets small, 200 bucks, around a third the size of the pot. which I guess is pretty common. It seems like a lot of people like to bet small on flops these days. So with my exact hand, I think we could go either way here between calling and occasionally raising. I think calling is the most standard play, considering he's going to have a lot of strong hands on this flop. But against such small sizing, occasionally check raising I think is fair, especially with the ace of diamonds. So this time I do that. I make it $700. And now, interestingly enough, Slick Rick puts in another raise. Now, of course, it's interesting to me in the moment, but as you guys can see, he's flopped the stone cold nuts with Queen 10, so I guess it makes some sense. $1,000 for me to call, and now I think we have a straightforward fold on our hand, but I decide to get adventurous and make the call, planning on turning my hand into a bluff if any diamond comes out. Queen of Hearts is not exactly what I had in mind, but now I guess I could try to represent a straight later on, since any 10 is now the nuts. But I check it over to him and see what he does, and what he does is check it back. River is also not great. It's the 8 of clubs, so the flush draw misses, and I'm not sure if I'd get a lot of credit if I let out here. He probably would just call with any hand that 3-bet the flop, like a set or a flop straight. Who knows, maybe he was getting sneaky and checking back the turn with the 10, so I decide to play it safe and check it. Slick Rick bets some amount, and I just fold right away since I have one of the worst hands I'd ever have now in this situation. This one goes to Rick. Nice hand. At this point, the game fully converts to 25, 50, 100. Essentially, everybody was straddling with even the occasional $200 double straddle. So for all intents and purposes, we are playing 25, 50, 100 now. JD opens up the action to 250 in late position. Ambrose calls on the button, and I've got 9-7 suited in the small blind. Probably too weak to continue, should mostly just fold. But the raise came from late position, and the button just calling is a little extra incentive to try to take this one down pre-flop. So I make it 14.50 to go. Gets back around to JD, the original raiser, and he decides to fold. Ambrose, however, makes the call once more on the button. So we are going heads up to a flop, which is not bad. 7-5-5, giving me top pair. Not something that happens too often when you play 9-7, so I'll happily take it. I decide to continue with a bet of 1/3 pot, $1,100. Ambrose makes the call, and we don't get the best turn card. It's the 8 of hearts. So now hands like 8-6 suited improve, 9-8 suited. Neither of these are super likely, but certainly possible. And not just that, but this card should be better for him than for me, generally speaking. So I decide to check and see what he does. Also, this opens up the door if he wants to bluff with hands that might have floated the flop, like, let's say, King 10 suited, for example, or Queen 9 suited. You guys get the idea. So I check it, but now Ambrose checks it back. When he does this, I feel like he's likely got a hand that could win at showdown, like pocket 4s, or perhaps a 7 himself. Maybe he's even checking back an 8, pocket 3s, pocket 2s. You guys get the idea. So when the river comes the king of clubs, I decide to lead out for a block bet of 1/10 the size of the pot, $600. Ambrose, of course, snap calls as he's now river top pair, which I didn't really expect. I thought if he floated the flop with king high, he'd likely try to bluff the turn. But what do I know about poker? Not much, because this pot is going over to my friend on the button, Ambrose. Nice hand, sir. Shortly after that hand, we are battling the same opponent. Action gets all the way to Ambrose in the big blind. I am in the $100 straddle, and he calls for the additional 50. I am away from the table, so they tell me I've got a hand. I decide to raise it up blind to $400. Ambrose makes the call, and we go heads up to a flop of ace 9-8. Ambrose checks. I see an ace out there, and I raised pre-flop. I don't really know if he knows that I haven't looked at my hand yet, but I decide to bet. Should be good for me and not great for him. So I put in $200. Ambrose makes the call, and we see a blank on the turn, the 4 of hearts. This time he checks, and I finally decide to look at my hand, see what's going on. And I'm pleasantly surprised to see that I've got second pair with a decent kicker, which I probably would have played exactly this way up to this point anyway. But now I decide to check it back with some pretty good showdown value, but not really a hand that can bet 3 streets and expect to get called by worse, I think. So I check it back, and the river's not bad. It's the 4 of clubs. Pretty dry run out. Hands like Jack 10 missed, 6-7, of course an 8 we are now ahead of. We do lose to an ace, of course, but when Ambrose checks it for a third time, I think it's most likely we've got the best hand. So I decide to go for some thin value. Of course, sometimes I'll get snap called by an ace, but he might also have an 8 or a small pocket pair, maybe even a weaker 9. So I bet 2/3 the size of the pot, $800. We don't get snap called, which I think is good news, but he does eventually toss in the call. Queen 9 is good. This time he's got Queen 8 offsuit, so we get quite the lucky flop and are able to get some extra value. Moral of the story is play more pots without looking at your cards. Well, at least not until you feel like you have to. Anyway, it's time for a much bigger pot. In fact, I think this might have been the biggest pot of the night. I'm not sure. Here we go. In this one, JD opens the action on the button to 300. Ambrose folds the small blind, and I look down at ace 10 in the big blind. Not exactly the best hand, especially when you're deep stacked, but considering JD opened on the button, I think he could be fairly wide. So I decide to take this ace 10 offsuit and get aggressive with it. I make it $1,200 to go. Straddle folds, but when it gets back to JD, he makes the call. So we're going heads up out of position to an okay flop. It's Queen Jack 2 Rainbow. This gives me a straight draw, an overcard, and of course it's a board which I could still connect pretty well with. Hands like ace queen, aces, kings, even king queen, pocket jacks. You guys get the idea. Ace king's even a straight draw with 2 overs. Lots of good stuff going on for me that I could have. Whereas JD is not going to love this flop. Quite often he's going to miss altogether with, let's say, small suited aces or middling pocket pairs that aren't in love with those 2 overcards. So that's a very long-winded explanation as to why I think continuing to apply pressure makes sense on a flop like this after re-raising pre-flop. I do that by putting in $800, but of course JD has flopped himself top pair with his queen 9 suited, so he makes the call, and we go to a turn which is a blank. For the most part, it's the 5 of hearts. Sure, sometimes I might have a hand like ace 5 suited, which now makes a pair, but for the most part, I think it's an irrelevant card. For all the reasons mentioned on the flop, however, I think continuing to bet makes sense. We just have so many value hands in a situation like this that balancing that out with bluffs like ace 10 suited or ace 4 suited, ace king occasionally, I think is the best course of action. So I decide to continue betting. $4,000 this time, just under the size of the pot, trying to set up an all-in on the river, just like I would if I had an overpair or, anything good. JD, once more, is undeterred. He thinks about it for quite some time, though, but does decide to call once more, perhaps thinking that I'm full of it, and he is correct in this instance. So after he makes the call, the pot has grown to $12,000, and he has around, I think, 11,000 behind. Not entirely sure if these graphics were accurate. When I looked at his stack, it looked like 11,000. Either way, 10,000, you guys get the point. River is the 5 of spades, which pairs the board. It's a pretty good card for me, I think. Like I said, I could have ace 5 suited, and now even if he was trapping with queen jack, for example, he loses to overpairs, which are aces and kings. So all in all, I think this is a great run out for me to empty the clip and try to get a fold from any queen, a non-believing jack perhaps, or even a hand like pocket 10s or pocket 9s that gets really sticky on the turn but can't hang on for one last bet. So I take my time, consider the situation, and do eventually reach the conclusion that an all-in is the best play, at least in my opinion. Don't fact check me on that, but I think it makes sense. I jam it all in there, fingers crossed that we don't get snap called, and sure enough, we do not get snap called. JD does not seem to love this situation, and I don't really envy his spot with queen 9 suited. After calling flop and turn, you now have one of the weakest hands you're going to have in this spot, but at the same time, he knows I could be bluffing, and it seems that he is not willing to get bluffed because after a few moments, he does toss in the reluctant call, and that's a good call, sir. I let him know he's good. He turns over the queen 9, and that is good enough to win this $32,000 pot. And that's the nature of poker, I guess. Sometimes you bluff and you lose. Sometimes you bluff and you win. Sometimes you have value and you get called. Sometimes you have value and they fold. Life goes on, just another poker hand. But what this poker hand does mean is I am now stuck nearly $10,000, as you guys can see here from the cumulative winnings. So we've got some work to do. And what better way to turn things around than the same exact hand, ace 10. This time we do have the suited variety though, which is nice. In this hand, the $200 straddle is on. Cousin Greg opens to $500, and I re-raise from the straddle to $2,000. Gonna be ahead most of the time, and it's just a good hand to re-raise pre-flop with, especially the suited variety, I should note. The offsuit one, your mileage may vary. Anyway, I make it $2,000. Cousin Greg makes the call with his king-queen offsuit, and we go heads up to a flop, which is not good. King 5 deuce all spades. That's a terrible flop for ace 10 suited, but Cousin Greg is going to have a lot of hands that I would benefit from getting a fold out of, pocket 7s, ace jack suited, maybe even the same hand. So considering that I would bet quite a few holdings on this board, I decide to continue with ace 10 of clubs. $1,300 into the pot. Cousin Greg makes the call, and at that point, I'm pretty much done with it. So when the turn comes to 6 of diamonds, I check it. He does not check it. He's got top pair and the second nut flush draw, so he puts in a bet of some amount, but I am no longer interested in continuing with this hand, considering that all the cards on the table don't match what I have in my hand. So I let it go, and we lose another one. Ace 10 not working out today. So if an ace and a 10 aren't the play, what about two 10s? Let's see. That's what I've got this hand. I make it $300 to go. Brian calls in the small blind, and now Austin re-raises from the straddle. Is he getting out of line? I'm not sure, but I make the call with pocket 10s. I'm in position, and I've got a good pocket pair. Brian lets go of his king 8 suited, and of course, as you guys can see, Austin is not getting out of line. He's got an ace and then another ace. That's a pretty good hand. On top of that, the flop comes down king 5-4. So even if he was getting a little feisty pre-flop with, let's say, a hand like king jack or king queen offsuit, or maybe even ace king, which of course is not necessarily feisty, but you guys get the idea. We're now losing to those hands as well. So not really loving this spot. Not the flop I want to continue on. He puts in a bet of, I think, 2,000 or 3,000. And of course, I fold my pocket 10s right away. I think it's worth noting that perhaps calling once, especially since I have the 10 of diamonds, is more than okay. In fact, it might even be the theoretically correct play, but Austin had been playing quite snug all day long, so I didn't suspect he was wide enough in this situation to call, even on the flop. Luckily, this time we're correct, and we don't lose that much with pocket 10s versus pocket aces. Now, this next hand is a little off the rails. It's more of a do what I say, not what I do situation, and it's essentially just an instance of me trying to be good for the game, if you will. So in this one, the $100 straddle is on once more. There's a raise to 250, and then Ambrose shoves all in blind on the button for 2150. He's been having a rough session so far, and he's down to his last 2,000 and change. I've got 6-5 suited in the small blind, and suited connectors, I'll be the first to say, are just terrible in all-ins. Those are hands you want when you're deep stacked with implied odds and all that other fancy gibberish. So in this spot, it is the easiest snap fold of all time. That being said, Ambrose has been quite friendly all night. He's someone I want to give action to. He's a good time to have at the table. And on top of that, he spilled some wine on me a few minutes ago. So I want to give him action. And if I crack his whatever he's got with 6 high, it's going to be a funny story at the bare minimum. I should note also that because a player raised to 250, this is an even worse call than it already is, because we could get squeezed out of the pot by whoever made it 250. But yeah, that doesn't happen, so not really a concern. Just thought I should say my play is even worse than you probably thought in the first place. Anyway, we decided to run it twice. He shows a 3, so I show a 5. First flop comes down ace high. We do turn a flush draw and river a pair, but that's going to be no good against his king 3 offsuit. So we're looking for some help on the second run out, which comes 7-8 deuce on the flop. We are open-ended, and any pair would of course help us as well. Turn is a 7. That's not looking good at all. But the river is a miraculous 6, so we are going to end up chopping this pot. But not before I give my buddy here a nice slow roll. All is well in a chop pot. Nothing wrong with a little slow roll here and there, I think. So yeah, this hand ends up not costing either of us too much. In fact, we both win $200, but it was quite the comical hand. So after sucking out versus king 3 with 6 high, I think it's time to ride the lightning, which explains this next hand. The graphics are a little wrong here. The raise to 100 is not a raise, it's actually a straddle. So JD opens to 250. I know it says 3-bet, but it's just a regular open. I have Jack 3 suited and decide to pounce on what I think is a weak raise from JD. And like I said, it's time to ride the lightning. I just chopped a hand with 6-5. That makes me feel like I'm on a heater. So I make it $900 to go. Rockets will now cold calls from the small blind, and JD makes the fold. So we're going to go heads up in position versus what I suspect is not the strongest hand ever, because let's face it, if he had like aces or kings, he probably would have re-raised me pre-flop. So I think he's got a hand like pocket 9s, pocket 10s or jacks. I didn't expect queens. It's pretty damn strong, but I'm happy that he just called, and at least we get to see a flop in position. Even better news is that we flop a flush draw on 8-7-4 with 2 hearts. So when he checks it to me, I decide to bet. This is a flop I'd often be checking back, so I think betting big makes more sense than betting small. I put in $1,400. Rockets will makes the call with his overpair and the queen of hearts. But what do you know? We get there on the turn. It's the 5 of hearts, giving me a straight draw and, of course, a flush. Rockets will checks, and now it's back on me. And I'm going to be honest, I think just continuing to bet when you have strong hands is the way to go. But sometimes I get caught up in what I think is the right theory and whatnot. I'm not necessarily saying that you guys should do this. In fact, I'm probably suggesting you do the opposite. But in this instance, I was thinking to myself, it's a lot more likely that he's got a flush or a straight, maybe two pair or a set. So I should generally be checking back this turn, I think. Even though I do have a flush, I think occasionally checking back flushes on turn cards that are better for your opponent is a good play long term. Again, that might just all be a bunch of nonsense, but that's my explanation for checking back on this turn. And we see the 10 of spades on the river. I'm hoping Rockets Will now leads out, but instead he wisely checks. He does have a pretty strong hand, so I think betting would have made total sense, but he does check it. And now it's time for me to value bet my flush. Could also be doing this with some hands like King Queen with a heart, or maybe even Ace 10 for value. All sorts of holdings I might bet on this river after Will checks it over to me 3 times. So I put in a bet of $4,000, nearly the size of the pot. Will doesn't seem to love it, but after playing queens this way, I don't see what choice he has aside from calling and hoping that he's good. So he does make the call. Unfortunately for him, he is not good this time, as we get very lucky with this Jack 3 of hearts. And that brings us to the last interesting hand of the night. In this one, Slick Rick opens from early position to 500, and it gets all the way to me in the $200 double straddle, looking down at 7-6 suited. Now, Slick Rick opened from early position, and like I said earlier, suited connectors are better when you're deep. So all that to say, calling is probably the best play in this instance, but I do think once in a very blue moon, re-raising with hands like this versus early position makes sense from the blinds. Again, not something I suggest doing often, if at all. I think if you never do this, it's more than okay, but occasionally getting frisky with these suited connectors I think is okay, even in this instance where Slick Rick should be pretty strong pre-flop. So anyway, I do make it $2,500 to go. Back on Slick Rick now, and fortunately for me, he does not have the strongest of holdings. I mean, it is a pretty nice hand, Ace 10 suited, but we could easily win against that hand post-flop. So he just makes the call, and we do go to a flop on which I think we stand a solid chance. It's King Jack 5 with 1 heart. So we've got a backdoor flush draw, a backdoor straight draw, and of course can represent all sorts of strength considering that there is a king and a jack out there, and I re-raised pre-flop. So I continue with a small bet of $1,700, right around 1/3 the size of the pot. Slick Rick makes the call with his gut shot and overcard, which I think makes sense, and we go to a turn card. The 9 of diamonds, I think, is an interesting one because it does give me a straight draw now, but it doesn't give me a flush draw, and I also think it's a card that's a little bit better for him. Mainly Queen 10 gets there, as well as hands like King 9 suited, Jack 9 suited, maybe even pocket 9s that floats on the flop against a small C-bet. All these hands I think are going to continue. Also, if he's got a hand like Jack 10 suited or King Queen suited, they all improve to a straight draw. So I don't expect us to get a lot of folds on this exact turn. Of course, he does have one of those hands that actually might have folded if I continue to bet, but I decide to check and see what Rick wants to do. We could also incorporate some check raises with a hand like the one I have, especially if he bets small now on this turn. Could also balance that out with aces, pocket kings, pocket jacks, king jack, all the strong stuff. But Slick Rick does not want to deal with all that and instead just checks it back with his straight draw in hopes of, I guess, improving on the river and seeing what I do. But instead, I improve on the river. Out of nowhere, the 8 of spades arrives, giving me the very disguised straight with 7-6. We essentially have the nuts. Of course, Queen 10 and 10-7 beat me as well, but those hands seem quite unlikely considering how the hands played out. Now it's on me, and what do we do here? Well, I think it's fairly straightforward. After Slick Rick calls the flop and then checks back on the turn, I think that indicates he's got a hand like a jack or perhaps even a king that checks back the turn for pot control. Hands that can win at showdown, since if he couldn't win at showdown, I would have expected him to bluff on the turn. For those reasons, I decide to bet pretty healthy here, $10,000 into this $8,500 pot, hoping to get paid off by a king, of course, or even a non-believing jack, like I said. Slick Rick, however, lets go of his cards right away, which makes sense looking back. He's just got ace high. So we don't end up getting a whole lot of value, but still always nice to put a bunch of money in the pot in hopes of getting called instead of hoping my opponent folds, which seems to be quite the trend lately on this channel. Anyway, we don't win the biggest pot ever, but still nice to end on a good note. That, ladies and gentlemen, was the last interesting hand of my night. As always, I hope you all enjoyed. All right, so we just finished the stream and unfortunately things didn't go super well for me. I was in for 75,000 and cashed out for around $12,000 less than that. So session could have gone better for sure, but nonetheless, I had a great time. I enjoyed a little bit of wine, and also the food here, the menu they have is incredible. So if you guys get a chance to come out here and play, certainly do that. Only thing is it's really cold, so bring a hoodie. That'd be my only complaint. Anyway, as always, thank you guys for watching. Thanks for the support. Hopefully next time in Texas, we book a win. I feel like I've gotten unlucky. Definitely played bad, but also gotten unlucky here. Maybe we'll turn that around next time. Until then, back to LA, back to regular programming. Thank you guys for the support. Good luck at your local tables. Until next time. Peace.